From day one of his presidency, Barack Hussein Obama was a man running scared of a shadow. If Obama had one aim, it has been to stop himself, his administration, and his legacy from being tarred from the same brush as George W. Bush. He knows that action can hijack a presidency, that decision can be scorned by successors, and he will do anything to preserve his reputation. The result has been crippling indecision and a frequent refusal to do what is necessary and to do what is right. So let's be clear on Team Wales what we will prove in this debate. And we have three things to define our policy. So first of all, we think that more harm than good should be defined primarily in terms of the number of lives that Obama has ruined. However, we're also happy to talk in more general terms about global security, safety, stability, and the protection of human rights. Secondly, we will not be comparing Obama with his political opponents, i.e. Bush, McCain, or Romney. Instead, we shall compare Obama to a fictional Obama, an alternative Obama, who within the same constraints proved wiser and more decisive. Number three, instead of going through every individual action of the Obama administration, we're going to describe his foreign policy in broad themes. We've already mentioned Obama's crippling fear of protecting his legacy, and I'll now outline the remaining of the themes in our substantive arguments. So firstly, we bring to you 3 points on Team Wales today. First of all, how Obama did not maintain a clear stance as the credible linchpin of global security. Second of all, how he was not a guardian of human rights. And third of all, my second speaker will be talking about why his drone policy has made it harder to fight the war on terror and has therefore done more harm than good. No, thank you. So first of all, how would Obama have maintained the USA as a credible linchpin of global security? So let's talk about what the role of the US is in global politics. America has famed themselves on being an international peacekeeper, set to intervene in the name of minorities, the poor and the oppressed. Obama was voted in on his promise to protect global security and human rights, and we believe that this justifies this mandate to help everyone, not just his own people. Yes.
Since drones are more accurate, don't they save more lives in the process than men on the ground?
So drones are more accurate than men on the ground? A person looking at a child is going to not shoot, given that they are an innocent civilian, rather than drones that don't discriminate and just bomb everyone. We don't see how that's true. So, how has he failed in protecting global security? Firstly, China. At times, the US under the Obama administration has been aggressive towards China, whilst on other occasions it has prioritized low tensions over the defense of certain key interests. It created the Trans-Pacific Partnership to create an exclusive club which excluded Chinese interests, but also made loud statements about its good intentions towards China. China, as a result, has been able to use aggression and bullying to resolve disputes and to test the boundaries of Obama's policy. So in recent years, we've seen newly aggressive Chinese policies in the South China Sea, as it artificially creates new islands, territories, and military bases, a very explicit threat to US allies in the same region. No, thank you. Vietnam and the Philippines have both massively increased military spending in recent years because of the lack of coordination that the Americans has left regional powers feeling exposed to Chinese aggression. The specter of war is hanging over Southeast Asia, and the fault is Obama's. So secondly, Russia. Obama's policy on Russia has been incredibly unclear and damaging. When the Ukrainian government of Viktor Yanukovych, no thank you, was overthrown in popular revolution in 2014, Obama clearly failed to indicate whether he supported the overthrow of this corrupt government or condemned the total flouting of democracy. Russia has continually probed the gaping holes in the US's position in an attempt to regain regional influence, and we feel this is very dangerous. It felt secure enough to invade and annex Crimea, and then to trigger and sustain a destabilizing proxy war in southeastern Ukraine. No, thank you. Putin is testing the boundaries, and we think this is very dangerous on our side of the house. Rather than seeing a negotiated solution to the complex problem, or the defense of Ukraine from Russian aggression, Obama has allowed the country to suffer death and destruction and to slide into instability. Yes. Yes.
It's clear from your speech that you think that America should be the world police. How do you comment?
We think that a part of America's foreign policy is actually its ability to protect others. We think that America benefits from institutions such as the UN, such as the IMF, that support its claims because part of America's stance as a leader of the free world is to protect democracy, protect human rights, and we think that this is completely justified, as Obama has justified this himself when he ran for election. So what we can see is that Obama's indecision and his lack of a stance has made the enemies of America test the boundaries and destabilize regions. And we think this is a very big problem on our side of the house, and therefore he's done more harm than good. So on to my second substantive, about why Obama has failed to be a guardian of human rights. So this is what we feel is an abdication of the leadership the United States has maintained for the entire post-World War II era. Obama is telling the world that we no longer, no thank you, will act to deter the aggression of kleptocratic, authoritarian regimes, and that smaller countries are left to fend for themselves. He's also objecting, no thank you, the long-standing U.S. policy of support for other countries' sovereignty and territorial integrity. The U.S. has been able to actively disincentivize war crimes and human rights issues by either the threat of action or physical intervention, and we can see this as it happened in the Yugoslavian genocide of 1995. Though we understand that it wasn't a perfect scheme, it wasn't 100% effective, it had significant positive impacts that we think that the U.S. should have maintained. So in terms of human rights abuses, how has Obama failed to protect regions of great instability? So for this we have two main examples. So firstly, in Syria. In Syria, one of Obama's greatest failings was the implementation of his fabled red line of chemical weapons. In August 2012, Obama declared using chemical weapons would be a red line for intervention in Syria. So then when the year after, conclusive evidence emerged of an Assad sarin gas attack on the Damascus suburb, which killed over 1,500 people, no intervention occurred still. So by not sticking to his statements, Obama has become entirely unreliable, and we think this is very dangerous for how he's proposed that he is a protector of human rights. Secondly, onto Myanmar. So Obama has shown that as long as the pretense of resolution exists, human rights are secondary. In Myanmar, the Rohingya minority has faced horrific maltreatment, arbitrary arrest, detention, and restrictions on movement as a daily reality, confinement in displacement camps, and repeated examples of assault and rape. Despite this, Obama has repeatedly ignored their plight, giving praise, no thank you, to current presidents for sustaining free and fair elections, even as millions of Rohingyas are denied basic human rights. His determination to be seen as a peacemaker and to not make the same mistakes as President Bush have overridden his commitment to the most vulnerable people anywhere in the world. He's also, we see, caused these harms in Cuba and Iran, when in Cuba, Obama's brash actions to paint himself as a peacemaker meant he bargained away the human rights of Cuban dissidents. And in Iran, when the sanctions that were lifted on Iran, despite the fact that they hang gay people on cranes, which is a clear confusion of where his human rights stance even lies. So overall, what we can see on Team Wales is that the U.S. is at its best when it can be a credible deterrent and backer for those who commit human rights abuses. Obama has dismantled this piece by piece, and the harms of that can be seen in the corpses of the Ukrainian citizens in Maidan, the flaming suburbs of the city of Donetsk. It can be seen in the bodies of the Rohingya floating in the Bay of Bengal as they try to escape their enemies on rafts, and the agonies of the Cuban and Iranian dissidents, who in previous years would have been entitled to think that the leader of the free world would be willing to fight for their rights. For all these reasons that I've stated, and because Obama has ultimately caused more harm than good in society, we are so proud to propose.
Speaking time was 8 minutes and 8. I'd now like to call Mia Marshall, the first speaker of the opposition, to give us his presentation.
The leader of the proposition today began with the statement, "A man running scared." A man running scared, ladies and gentlemen. Does a man running scared use foreign assistance to significantly aid development? Does a man running scared use smart power to restore international relations and security? Does a man running scared use trade agreements to forge strong diplomatic ties with several countries? Ladies and gentlemen, we heard Team Opposition, the leader of Team Opposition, begin the argument with outlining their substantives and where they would like to go. She spoke of global security and guardian of human rights. Now, when posed the question about if America should be the war police, she obviously agreed with this statement, but in the latest UN General Assembly meeting, President Barack Obama understands that America does have a role in fostering or watching out for wars, etc. But America is not necessarily the world's war police. So we recognize straight away here that America cannot solve all the world's problems. And today she has built an argument which encompasses around the fact that America really should be able to come in and solve everyone's problems. And if they don't solve all these problems, his foreign policy, in essence, has failed. But let's not forget that Obama's foreign policy also has to cater to some aspect of the running of the United States and the functioning of the United States as well. So what we just want to remind Team Opposition is that America cannot solve all the problems of the world, and we have to keep that in our minds as this debate progresses. So she spoke of human rights, guardian of human rights. But ladies and gentlemen, I just want you to ponder upon the question, ponder upon the question, whether or not can Barack Obama himself do something efficiently and effectively in Myanmar and Syria. These are places that have governments. These are places that have to secure such human rights. And as we said before, America is definitely cannot hold all the world's problems, hold the weight of the world. Now, as I get into my argument, we will continue to refute these things, these preposterous notions put forward by Team Opposition. Okay, so let's begin. I'll start with the first substantive, which deals with foreign assistance, significantly aided development. And I will also address the second substantive, which deals with smart power, restores international relations and security. And my seconder will deal with the trade and economic benefits. Now, how we would like to assess Obama's foreign policy is primarily on that of development, defense, and diplomacy. So we will use this foundation as a standard to assess the effectiveness of his administration and prove today why his foreign policy has in fact done more good than harm. So let's begin. Foreign assistance significantly aided development. Now, assistance and development is one of the pillars of the Obama administration's foreign policy. So U.S. foreign aid is developed around the rationales of national security, commercial interests, and humanitarian concerns. So under the Obama administration, total U.S. foreign aid has increased from $39.4 billion in 2010 to $50.3 billion in 2015, showing the importance of U.S. assistance to aid development. Assistance made significant impact throughout the world, reflecting geospecific issues, primarily by decreasing global poverty and hunger levels, boosting agricultural sustainability, and electrifying Africa. All of these things which Team Opposition failed to share with you today. So we will show how the impact of foreign assistance outweighs the arguments of the proposition by assessing two initiatives launched under the Obama administration, and this is Feed the Future and Power Africa. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there's still a war on hunger, there's still a war on poverty, and guess what? Obama's foreign policy has catered to that, and he's battling, and this is something that Team Opposition fails to recognize, that there are other wars in which his foreign policy treats to. So we have the Feed the Future, which was launched in May 2010 by the Obama administration, aimed to assist 18 million vulnerable women, children, and families to escape hunger and poverty. And as a result of this, there was a 33% decrease in child stunting in Ghana and 25% in Kenya. Additionally, 36,000 beneficiaries in Honduras rose above the extreme poverty threshold of $1.25 US per day. So these results aid development how, ladies and gentlemen? By reducing hunger and poverty levels, we increase the life expectancies of populations, hence increasing the middle class. So he also provided tools and technologies to 2.5 million smallholder farms, thereby providing for agricultural sustainability in the form of new jobs, the boosting of local markets, hence sustaining life. So these benefits clearly outweigh the harms outlined by Team Proposition, as this aid has not only brought development in the agricultural sector, economically and in sustainability, but has made significant progress in the area of food security, poverty, which no other country has effectively tackled. So in this aspect, we do in fact see that Obama's foreign policy in fact sustains life. I'll take that POA now.
Two of your burdens are labelled defence and diplomacy. Can you tell us what these words mean?
Defense, I'm glad that he asked that, because those are two critical words outlined in Obama's foreign policy when we see it. And defense really means protection of the said state. Diplomacy deals with the international relations between the US and other countries. And we also have its defense, diplomacy, and development. And development speaks to, we have trade development, we actually have the infrastructural development on a whole. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, let me just continue the substantive with looking at electricity. And this is where we had Electrifying Africa coming out. So we had the Power Africa initiative, which was launched under the USAID, an agency aimed at the international development pillar of US foreign policy, made significant impact in sub-Saharan Africa. So in its first year, ladies and gentlemen, it saw 5 million new connections to electrify and $18 billion in non-US assistance contributed. So ladies and gentlemen, let's look at smart power, because Team Opposition will come with an argument surrounding drone warfare. So restoring international relations has a direct influence on the said development, diplomacy, and defense. And we recognize that the threat of nuclear warfare was a pressing ordeal to tackle, primarily under the foreign policy pillar of defense, as it placed a threat on the US homeland. So if the US had the threat of nuclear warfare or had to be engaged in a physical nuclear war, how could it be expected to address these other issues and assist countries in distress? So the Obama administration launched increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks against Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities. So we recognize the need for such drone warfare and for such drone attacks. So we recognize also that during the fostering of these said relations, fostering these international relations, it was necessary that we also highlighted that the relations between Cuba and the US were also restored in such. And we recognize with that, we'll close with the fact that 64, the deaths outside of the actual drone warfare, civilian casualties, was 64 to 119. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your speech. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 26 seconds. Please welcome Jean Lee, the second speaker of the proposition.
Barack Hussein Obama is so afraid of being seen as the second George W. Bush, he has turned a blind eye to the multiple evils in this world. And for that reason alone, and that reason, we say that his foreign policy has caused more harm than good. It was very interesting from the first speaker of Barbados. They said that the United States is not the world police, and therefore there was no obligation on the United States to intervene, and therefore this exonerates Barack Hussein Obama from every single thing. Panel, recognize that the justification that the United States used to invade Afghanistan was based on the criteria that we were the world police, and every single other subsequent invasion was also based on that notion they were the world police. So we just disagree with this notion that the Americans are not the world police. On this ground alone, we think that Obama has a stake in this entire policy. Now, the debate falls into two grounds. Firstly, on the ground of his inaction, and secondly, on the ground of what he actually did, his actions. So firstly, I'd like to look at Barack Hussein Obama's inaction. So, my first speaker told you a few things, right? He told you that Obama did not draw, no thank you, a clear line which caused Putin to push his boundaries, which led to the annexation of Crimea. What did we hear? No response. We then told you that him failing to draw, he drew a red line, and then he did not enforce the red line, which caused a chemical attack in Damascus by Bashar al-Assad in Syria. What did we hear? No response. We then told you how he failed to intervene in Myanmar. We once again heard no response. The only thing we heard a response to was our argument on Cuba. So let's deal with it right here and right now. We told you that when he lifted the sanctions on Cuba, he could have actually gained a lot more human rights by actually stipulating within the contract to have the kinds of dictators live and release the kinds of political dissidents that gets arrested and locked away. So what did we hear? We heard that it was a good thing, right? We disagree for the very simple reason that by actually allowing these kind of dictators to continue abusing human rights, he has decreased the credibility of the entire United States government in trying to enforce democratization over these regions. What does this mean? This means that it's now very difficult for Barack Hussein Obama to say, we think you need to change your foreign policy, we think you need to change your domestic policy and improve human rights, because he has now accepted that some countries, if they are rich enough or if they have important stakes within the global security, no thank you, they can accept that human rights abuses are okay. This prevents future presidents from being able to say, we reject dictatorships, we reject autocracies, and therefore change our policies. This undermines the principal credibility, and we say that's terrible, that's not okay. Before I go on, tell me why it is.
So therefore, you believe that we should allow Cubans to not be developed, for the Cuban nation to not be developed?
I'm sorry, the problem is, when you allow, okay fine, first of all, when you open up the trade and lift out the sanctions, what happens is, you further allow Cuba to develop and gain more money to abuse more human rights. You allow the current kinds of oligarchs and the kinds of people who already have very powerful connections in these countries to gain even more money to continue their reign over the country, but more importantly, to continue their ability to control the country. So we think that all the harms we talked to you about will be further enforced on your side of the house because now they have more money to fund these kind of abuses. On the second level, we say that he could have actually exchanged more human rights from being attained as a result of lifting the sanctions, which he failed to do, and we say those people who are currently being locked behind bars are on your side of the house. Secondly, let's talk about the actions of Barack Hussein Obama. What did we hear? We heard that he used development aid to alleviate poverty and global hunger. First of all, this is a contradiction to the notion that the United States is not a world police. If that's the case, then why do you even intervene to begin with? We need a clarification from the next speaker. But secondly, we say a lot of the $18 billion they talked about in development aid panel is lost due to corruption, where local charities siphon off a lot of these money, which means very little amount actually trickle down to real people. But more than that, we say in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of these aid are actually stolen by war factions and warlords to actually fund their own armies and fund their own soldiers. So ultimately, Barack Hussein Obama has strengthened the kinds of problems within these regions we are trying to help, not actually alleviating it. But let's take it one step further. Let's take that point of thank you at its highest ground. We say that even if we give them every single thing they want, the problem is they've only proven how Barack Hussein Obama has helped Kenya and Ghana. He's not talked about how he has neglected the entire of the Middle East, or how when he withdrew the troops, he have left a vacuum that allowed ISIS to take hold, and more importantly, caused 500,000 people to die in the Syrian crisis alone. You need to deal with that, your next speaker. We don't think your case can stand. Let me now move on to my substantive material. I'll be talking to you about how drones only strengthened terrorism and made it harder to fight the war on terror. My substantive will directly rebut their point on drones itself. Let me tell you what happens on the ground level after a drone strike happens. Let's suppose there was a wedding taking place and the Obama administration believes a potential terror suspect was amongst the guests and have authorized a drone strike. At ground zero panel, beyond the thick black fumes from the flames, hundreds of human bodies pile over one another, charred beyond recognition or identification. Those people who lay in their blood were people's fathers, mothers, sons and daughters and friends. They were loved ones. Recognize, panel, that drones have a hit rate of just 2%. This means that only 2% of people who were killed by drones from 2012 to 2015 were actually militant terrorists. This means out of every 1 person, everyone carries a kill. Barack Hussein Obama has slain 49 other innocent civilians. Before I go on to tell you why this is terrible, yes?
Yes, that statistic came from Stanford University and it deals with mainly Bush's administration. How can you not to justify Obama's foreign policy?
I'm sorry, but the same drone technology is being used. It's on you and your side of the house to come up here and justify why killing 49 other innocent people is worth it, and how can you justify that cost in itself. But more than we say, when you actually sting so many innocent people, that's when the ordinary civilians who lost their loved ones, who are not taking sides, start buying into the anti-Western narrative peddled by ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and start joining ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and that's when you strengthen their membership. That's when you strengthen these terror groups. That's when you strengthen their ability to commit more harm and atrocities around the world. Panel, what I just told you was not a piece of hypothesis, but an actual wedding drone strike that Barack Hussein Obama authorized in Yemen 2 years ago. Recognize also, panel, that whenever the Obama administration launches a drone strike in Yemen or Pakistan, they do not consult the local governments. This is terrible, because this prevents local governments, no thank you, from coming up with effective counter-terrorist strategies, as they do not know when the United States government is going to launch another drone strike in their regions. But more than that, we say, right, this fundamentally decreases the ability to fight terrorism. On a second level, we say that whenever the Obama administration launches a drone strike, the local government, local people grow increasingly frustrated with the government for failing to protect themselves and their loved ones from the kinds of drone strikes and the infringement of sovereignty from the Obama administration. No, thank you. So these people tend to hold a lot of riots, a lot of rallies, a lot of protests. This increases the frustration upon these governments, but more importantly, causes these governments to grow increasingly resentful of the Obama administration and therefore be less willing to cooperate with the Obama administration in trying to create counter-terrorist strategies to combat terrorism. What does this mean? This means that the Pakistani-Yemeni government will have less information sharing with the United States government altogether. This means it's even harder for us to even combat terrorism in the future, but more importantly, because there are less information sharing, this has fundamentally decreased the ability of these governments to try to remove terrorism, which means there will be more terrorist acts within these countries, and therefore the problem will be left into solving it via using more drone strikes in the future, because now when the Obama administration sees there are even more hazardous effects within these regions, they will resort to even more drone strikes to try to resolve the problem, exacerbating all the kinds of problems and harms we've told you. Panel, recognize that there are girls in Pakistan who are afraid of the blue sky. They are afraid of the blue sky because drones fly when the skies are grey. We can resolve that. We can change that. And it's from outside the house that we say we're very proud to oppose.
Thank you for your speech. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 1 second. I'd now like to call David Johnson, the second speaker of the opposition, to give his speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, this morning the proposition has presented a very limited argument. And though they said they wouldn't have done this, though they said they wouldn't have narrowed in on certain issues, that's exactly what they have done. Okay? So, but we on the side opposition believe that foreign policy can in fact be summarized in the 3Ds, and that's the policy that we've developed this morning. Development, defense, and diplomacy. And because the Obama administration has effectively catered to these specific areas is why this House believes that the Obama's administration foreign policy has not done more harm than good. But before we bring our final argument this morning, it's important that we address the areas that were brought up by Team Proposition. So in doing this rebuttal, I will address two main areas, and one, that's the role of foreign policy, and two, development. So what exactly is the role of foreign policy, ladies and gentlemen? And what Team Proposition has failed to recognize was that foreign policy is in fact a very broad spectrum, okay? And although they stated that they would have narrowed it, that's what they did. So the role of Obama's foreign policy was in fact to promote international relations in addition to changing the anti-US sentiment, which he did, and building strong relationships, which he did via trade. No, thank you. Okay, and Obama has in fact done this. And when we look at the Cuba example that they saw, they thought that they were so quick to rebut, we actually saw that it actually forged strong ties. And it was observed when I heard, no thank you, it was observed when I heard from this side of the playing field that we should not go and invest in trade and aid within Cuba because we were pushing people towards more human rights abuses. But hey, how can we address human rights abuses if we do not have development? That's my main question, and I will challenge them to answer that. No, thank you. So in fact, in going into Cuba, when we saw the release of prisoners, when we saw that there was more freedom, when we see that there's more trade, then we can expect in the future, therefore, that there will be development in terms of human rights. So therefore, Obama's foreign policy, therefore, was in fact laying a framework, ladies and gentlemen, in order to gain, no thank you, in order to gain all these solutions that we want. So it's not something that we can just step into, ladies and gentlemen, and at the snap of a finger, find a solution. But there must be the laying of a framework, and no thank you. That's in fact what Obama's foreign policy is targeting. So they misconstrued, in fact, the arguments that we in fact made, and they even took the whole argument that we placed forward about the world police, and they misconstrued it, because they used it against us to suggest that because he's not putting forward this whole notion of being the world police, that we are therefore not just in going forward to development. But I dare say, ladies and gentlemen, that being the world police does not mean that not being the world police does not mean that you cannot see the issues around you and attempt to face them. So we're not saying this morning, I would like to make this very abundantly clear, we're not saying this morning that that America can solve all the issues, but we definitely see that there's progress. We definitely see that Obama is laying a framework, and especially when it comes to trade, which we'll look at in the next area of development, that he has in fact forged stronger relationships, forged stronger diplomatic ties, and therefore laid a framework for the future to grow. So when we look at development, and we speak of the misconstruing of this argument about the world police, when we look at Power Africa, when we look at Feed the Future, this was an example of Obama sending in aid towards countries in order to aid development. So when we have development, we see that therefore there are farmers, for instance, who are getting out of poverty. And may I draw your attention to the fact that eradicating poverty, no thank you, that eradicating poverty is still the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal number 1 of the UN. So as Obama and the US is a major contributing factor towards the United Nations, then we see that his whole goal should be, in fact, to eradicate poverty. And that's exactly what he's been doing. With the programs, no thank you, like Power Africa and Feed the Future, we saw the WASH program in addition. He was in fact sending aid towards these countries to break the cycle of poverty, and we actually saw that people were rising above the poverty line of $2 US a day. So we're saying that whole argument that they brought forward, they're yet to prove how development, no thank you, they're yet to prove how development has not properly aided several countries, and why therefore should we abandon this whole aid therefore. No thank you. So they also use the argument about innocent people being killed. But hey, wars, people are killed. So we will see that there's civilians killed, but what we see is that via the Obama administration, that he significantly reduced the lives that were lost because of drones. My leader would have spoken to the fact that there are only 64 to 119 casualties when we have drone warfare, significantly less than when we see on the front line warfare. So ladies and gentlemen, yes, we're going to see some casualties, but we see a significant reduction when we look at Obama's foreign policy. They also presented an argument surrounding policies implemented by Bush. And as they would have said at the beginning of their argument, they're not here to talk about Obama's predecessors. So what exactly are we talking about when we're speaking of Bush? I dare answer that question. Please restructure your argument and come with a better strategy. And they also use the example of the Middle East. And they mentioned countries like Iraq, but what they failed to address was that he significantly reduced nuclear readiness within Iraq. And in filling nuclear reactors with cement, making it harder for these Iraqi nations to obtain nuclear materials, and Iran, for example, to obtain nuclear materials, we've seen that there's a significant reduction in the threat, ladies and gentlemen. So therefore, that's why we're here today, to believe, therefore, that the Obama's foreign policy has in fact done more good than harm. So we challenge a team proposition to answer some of these questions. So now I will transition into my substantive, which addresses trade and economic benefits, but before, let me take that POA.
So, Iran is one of the biggest sponsors of terrorists. When you lift the sanctions, you allow these local businesses and governments with more money to fund terrorism. Tell me how that's a good thing.
It is not a matter of just dishing out money, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, when we come to foreign policy, it's directed. And what we've seen from the Obama foreign policy is that this aid does not just go there, but it comes with technocrats, it comes with people who are seeing, looking forward, and they're seeing the issues at hand and they're targeting. So when we looked at that, at trade and diplomatic ties that were formed with Iran, yes, sanctions, some sanctions were lifted, but some sanctions still remain. And this was in order to protect and protect the defensive measures within the United States, ladies and gentlemen. So therefore we see that Obama's foreign policy has in fact seen these issues and have directly tackled them. So when we look at trade and economical benefits, by assessing the success of implemented free trade agreements, when we look at the National Export Initiative, which would have been aimed at development within America itself, we would have seen that it was formed with 20 other countries, including Colombia, Panama, Russia, and South Korea. And as a result, in US in 2012, exports from US increased to 2.2 trillion, and it would have supported 9.8 million jobs. So when we see that there's development at home, when we see that there's an increase in jobs at home, therefore we can expect that there will be economic freedom. There are people who will be able to spend more money, and there's development at home. So yes, foreign policy does in fact affect lives at home. And when we look at that initiative, when we look at the trade partnerships that he would have forced, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade investment, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, we see that he was debunking the previous NAFTA agreement and therefore making a change so that there will be common standards surrounding several countries. So we see that Obama's foreign policy was not only aimed at the US itself, but it was also aimed abroad. So ladies and gentlemen, our argument today is surrounding trade and economic benefits, the forging of diplomatic ties, development, defense, and diplomacy, and therefore we see that the Obama administration foreign policy has in fact done more good than harm. I thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 23 seconds. It's now my pleasure to ask David Foster-Davies, the third speaker of the proposition, to give his speech.
Three issues in this speech. First of all, we're going to discuss whether multilateralism or American unilateralism is generally better for humanity. Secondly, we're going to discuss how Obama's inaction and his weakness has affected the world. And thirdly, we're going to discuss areas where he has acted in a decisive way. Before that, briefly, I'd like to discuss the burdens both sides have placed. We don't think there's a tangible difference between defense, diplomacy, and development, and the concept of helping human rights and just generally benefiting people. I think that good diplomacy probably helps people's lives. Safe defense policy probably helps people's lives. There's no meaningful distinction here between either side. What I would say, though, is that if any presidency in recent history from the United States has not defended people's rights to live in a country of self-determined borders, then it would be Obama, where Ukraine has been, parts of Ukraine have been annexed by Russia, for example. I would say that diplomacy has been some of the weakest we've ever seen from the United States from Obama. So on their own burdens, they lose this debate. First of all, multilateralism versus American unilateralism. Why do we favour the latter, right? They first claimed that multilateralism was better because it helped us to solve problems with a superior sort of decision-making process. They never gave any reasons for this. We give you two reasons why this isn't true. First of all, the risk of major conflict is much increased when there are significant major powers close to each other in military capability who feel they can threaten one another and try and get one over on the other. See, like the First World War, where Germany and the UK had fairly similar military capacity and were therefore incentivized to have a war, which is incredibly unlikely if the United States is so much more powerful than any other power. That is important because war is terrible. War destroys lives. It kills people. It destroys agricultural production. It makes people hungry. It makes them homeless. There are 11 million homeless in Syria. We don't want wars to happen. Having one major power is the best deterrent for that. Secondly, we tell you, under a system of multilateralism, proxy wars spread. Look at Angola as a clear example of this. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union funded one side, and the Americans funded the other side. And this stopped immediately as soon as the Cold War finished, because the Americans now had a priority, which was to help people and ensure stability in these regions, as opposed to just getting influence over the Soviet Union in these areas. That's incredibly problematic, because if your name is the USSR or the US, you frankly don't matter under a multilateral world system. Lastly, we tell you, compared to other unilateral powers, the Americans, as a democracy which generally stand up for human rights and generally care about these kind of things, are probably superior to countries like China and Russia. But then they told us that America can't solve all the world problems, so we need multilateralism. Of course they can't solve all the world problems, but if multilateralism is a system which is causing so many harms and is actually worsening the situations rather than solving those problems, that is obviously not relevant to the debate. They need to show why that is important. Second area to discuss, Obama's inaction and his weakness. We gave you a number of reasons and a number of examples of how Obama's decision-making has been so ambiguous and so lacking in clarity and consistency that it has caused horrendous damage to the international system, and by consequence, it has damaged many people's lives. But before I move on to that, I'll take this POI.
Under the TPP, for every 10% decrease in tariffs, there's a 1% decrease in gender wage gap under Obama's under Obama's trade. How do you respond to this?
So I respond to this by saying that the TPP has actively separated China from other economies in Southeast Asia, which has caused huge amounts of tension, which in the next few years will probably result in a major conflict over the South China Sea. But I'll get into that in more detail on my third area of clash. So, in terms of inaction and weakness, we told you about China, we told you about Russia. Apparently Team Barbados weren't willing to engage with our mechanism here. We explained that Obama was responsible for these problems because he failed to reassure allies and failed to make clear to rivals in the international world what the US was going to do, what their perspective was, right? Because if Putin knows that America will intervene to defend Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, then Putin probably won't make that decision. Because ambiguity, Putin is the kind of individual who's incentivized to push the boundaries further and further to increase Russian influence within Eastern Europe. That is incredibly damaging because you suppress democracy and the right of the Crimean people to decide where they live and what country they live in. You also massively destabilize areas of eastern Ukraine to the detriment of people's economic security. Right? We gave you all of this analysis and there was barely any engagement with it. We would like more in the next speech because the real problem with all this ambiguity is that it does two things. It first of all means that annexations are possible, that international laws which protect people's rights to live in a country that they have determined to live in, to have self-determination, is massively undermined when the international rules are not being upheld by the Americans. And secondly, the chance of major conflict is increased because different actors are no longer acting in unison, right? You say if America is making clear to all of its allies, here is where we stand, here is where we want you to fit in with our policy making, but it's being incredibly ambiguous, it makes it more likely that countries like Ukraine are more likely to be a bit more belligerent towards countries like Russia, and then that causes massive problems with regards to destabilization, and perhaps the Americans won't go in and solve
On that point, sir.
That is also problematic. The fewer actors that are making separate decisions, the better for stability and the better outcomes we get, because there are fewer misunderstandings between different parties. Secondly, we told you about human rights, and we did get a bit of engagement here from Barbados. We told you that it was incredibly problematic that the red line was enforced, that it was not okay to use chemical weapons on civilians, that was outlawed by international law. And Assad did this, despite Obama's prior promises to engage and use military force to depose Assad if he did such a thing. He allowed him to get away with it scot-free. That was unacceptable, and the big problem with this, as Sean told you, was that it makes it more likely that future dictators will try their luck, and that the deterrence that exists that international rules are only potent if there is a major power willing to stand up and defend them, right? Genocides will happen unless America or another major power is willing to stand in and say, we will stop them if you do them, as they did in Bosnia. That is incredibly problematic, something they have not engaged with. What they did tell us, though, is that Cuba was fine. It's fine to encourage development in this country. We gave you a response. We first of all told you that it did not solve other problems in Cuba like arbitrary arrest and other injustices which exist in these countries. But more important than that, who do the benefits of this development accrue to? They accrue to powerful groups within these kind of countries who are just going to reinforce the forces of autocracy in these countries, which prevent, therefore, development economically and prevent people having security. Another example of this was in Iran, right? We tell you the Revolutionary Guards overwhelmingly will benefit from the sanctions being lifted in there, and that's massively damaging because they will just reinforce all of the horrible policies they have within Iran. So development does not accrue to individuals who ought to have it. No thanks. They told us on Iran that it was okay because there was a nuclear deal. First of all, the nuclear deal is really really bad because the centrifuges are still running, and Iran could have a bomb within 12 months perhaps, which is incredibly problematic. But secondly, you didn't deal with all of the other problems that need to be dealt with. Terrorism will still be supported by Iran. Hezbollah is still being funded and destabilizing Lebanon and bombing Israel. That is totally unacceptable. All of the problems with human rights are still existent within Iran. There was way more than Obama could have done with that deal, but he was too busy trying to defend his legacy as well as that was incredibly problematic. Lastly, I'll deal with action, right? They told us about foreign aid development. They told us why this was important. We gave you lots of reasons which they did not respond to and did not choose to develop. We told you why this is problematic because actually most of the money goes towards corrupt sources, many of which are actually furthering conflict in these areas, which is causing hunger, which is causing destabilization, because you can't grow crops when people are going to steal your money, steal your crops because they're fighting a war. They told us then about trade deals. We say, importantly, the economics between various partners are already good, but these trade deals were actively used to be aggressive towards China and to isolate them from the international system. China is growing as an economic power, and Obama would have been far better off accommodating that with negotiation rather than trying to isolate them with the TPP, which does not include China as an economy. That is incredibly antagonistic, makes it more likely that tensions will break out like something like the South China Sea, with the consequent harms that we've already told you war brings. Right? I think development is important, but we say that causing war is the #1 way of stopping development from happening, and on a comparative is more important. We told you why drones are so problematic. Their only response was that this was Bush's policy, and Obama could not be held accountable. One, that's factually not true. Obama institutionalized the use of drones as the main method of causing war, to the detriment of the relationship with Pakistan, to the detriment of the war on terror, because now we can't even use the supply routes going into Afghanistan to fight groups like the Taliban. But secondly, we tell you that even if he wasn't responsible for starting the policy, he has continued it and expanded it. That is important. He's responsible for that. He didn't have to copy Bush in every way. He didn't invade Iraq. He doesn't have to copy him in every single way. We say that Obama's foreign policy has generally been characterized by weakness and by mistakes. He has failed to be decisive. He has failed to stand for America as the enforcer of global rules. He has abandoned so many vulnerable people. So we are so proud today to propose this motion.
Thanks for your speech. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 13 seconds. Please welcome David Gittens, the first speaker of the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my job today to bring this debate back into focus. I'll do this by addressing 3 main areas of clash: diplomacy, development, and defense. So what have we heard about diplomacy from Team Proposition? They've told us, ladies and gentlemen, that America is the world police. And they justify this by the invasion of Afghanistan. But let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that that was in the days of Bush. We are here to discuss Obama's foreign policy. But they continue to speak about the world, that Obama is the leader of the world police. And they spoke about China and Russia and the annexation of Ukraine. But ladies and gentlemen, Obama cannot be, America cannot be the world police. And they understood that later down in their speeches, when they continue to contradict themselves, when they spoke about Yemen and invading of these countries without approval. And then they said war isn't good. So if you want Obama to be the world police, but you understand that war is not good, what do you want? What do you want from Obama? The proposition does not seem to know. They do not seem to understand what they want. But ladies and gentlemen, we are showing you today that Obama has understood diplomacy. He's using smart power. He's using both direct coercion and indirect coercion of countries, going through the UN. And in 2011, in Iraq, he pulled out troops because the Iraq government did not want troops on the ground anymore. We've also showed you how he utilized free trade agreements to bring countries closer together, such as the National Export Initiative with 20 countries such as Colombia, Peru, and Russia. And then we've shown you how he used Cuba as well, how he brought back diplomatic relations with Cuba. And ladies and gentlemen, more so they continue to go on this rant about drones, and that drones are a problem. But ladies and gentlemen, drones help with diplomacy. This told us, ladies and gentlemen, that
Information.
that the drone strikes are killing more people. But this is absolutely absurd. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the White House has released statistics showing that the drone deaths from Obama's foreign policy, from his drone strikes, were only 64 to 119 persons. Ladies and gentlemen, the statistics they brought today were of Bush. We are not debating Bush's foreign policy. We are debating Obama's foreign policy. And I would like to move on to development. We know that we have a war on hunger, and we have a war on poverty, and Obama recognizes this. And he is adamantly fighting to secure our future. He's using Feed the Future and Power Africa, where we're saying that child stunting in Ghana is decreased by 33%. I was saying Power Africa that is supplying over 2,000 megawatts of electricity to Africans so that they can work, produce, and better their lives, so that they can break their cycle of poverty.
Vietnam and the Philippines have both more than doubled defence spending in recent years. Every dollar on defence spending because of Obama's inaction is a dollar taken away from the aid spending that could have used to help poor people in the country.
Ladies and gentlemen, this goes back to their notion of Obama being the world police. We're saying, ladies and gentlemen, that Obama cannot do everything, but what he's doing, we're weighing what he has done and seeing if it has caused more good than harm. And ladies and gentlemen, we have seen that it has caused more good than harm. And if we want to speak about certain actions, let's take Libya for example, where it was not just America, but it was also England and France. And if we're talking about action, then we should hold everyone accountable, and you cannot just hold one country accountable for every problem in the world. Moreover, in development, they spoke about Cuba. And they told us we should not have left sanctions against Cuba. We shouldn't have brought diplomacy to Cuba. We should not innate free trade with Cuba. They don't want us to develop, this side of the house does not want us to develop the world, ladies and gentlemen. They are against development of human beings. As they said, they said that we have to categorize how good the foreign policy is based on the effect on lives. So if they do not want the development of lives, ladies and gentlemen, obviously they are a flawed system. Ladies and gentlemen, we can clearly see that with development, Cuba will be able to rise up out of the human rights actions. Ladies and gentlemen, Cuba did not become communist because it wanted to. If we look at history, Cuba became communist because it had to. It had to, and we are acknowledging that, and we're using, and Obama has realized this, and he has lifted sanctions against Cuba. Moreover, we see that for free trade, Obama has initiated the National Export Initiative, the TTP and the TTIP. And we've seen increasing numbers in trade, such as in 2012, $2.2 trillion, and in 2015, $2.34 trillion. And this is in comparison to when Bush was in power, and we only had $1.58 trillion in exports. So we see that at home in America, Obama's foreign policy is doing good, but more so is doing good abroad with common standards, which for labor, for environment, and anti-corruption measures, so that we can develop these partnering countries, so that we can better their lives. And when we move on to defense, ladies and gentlemen, this side of the house kept on speaking about drones. I would like to quote a statistic they used. 2% of all drone strike victims were the militants. But ladies and gentlemen, if they did their research, they would know that this statistic came from Stanford University and New York University in 2012. And this mainly spoke to Bush's foreign policy and his drone strikes. So I have yet to understand how they're able to use these statistics and for Obama's foreign policy. They stood up here today, ladies and gentlemen, and said, we are not going to debate Bush's foreign policy. We're going to debate Obama, and we're going to debate Obama against Obama, a fictional Obama. But I've yet to even hear this fictional Obama in their speeches. I've only heard them debate Bush for the entire time, and they want to link Bush and Obama together. But ladies and gentlemen, we cannot do so. We are here focusing on Obama. And if we look at the drone strikes, we see that Obama using drone strikes has taken out over 2,000 terrorists. And that, as I said already, my leader has said, victims of drone strikes that weren't militants were only between 64 to 119, not the thousands that they wish to paint. And when we look at Iran, when they spoke about Iran, and they made such a fallacious and fictitious statement that Iran funds terrorists. But this is simply not so. Iran does not fund terrorists. And not only that, they misunderstood the deal with Iran, and that deal with Iran was to stop the uranium enrichment development. It was to protect the world. It was to ensure our security and our development. So ladies and gentlemen, it is clear today that we can look at diplomacy, development, and defense. And when we weigh whether it was more harmful or more good, the good outweighs the harm. Thank you.
Thanks for your speech. Speaking time was 8 minutes and 11 seconds. It's now my pleasure to ask David Johnson to give the opposition's reply speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here this morning is a very conflicted debate. Two distinct sides, two different views. So I'll point it out. A side which values human rights, but still cannot see a link between human rights and pursuing poverty alleviation, which is MDG number 1. Versus a side which pursues human rights in aiding development and informing diplomatic ties and promoting international relations. A side which lives in a fantasy world where one man can solve all the world's issues, versus a side which sees that the laying of a framework aids development and can lay the framework towards solving issues. So where does the contrast lie this morning, ladies and gentlemen, is the question I will seek to ask. So my responsibility this morning is to draw this debate to a close and show you, therefore, why our argument on team opposition is the stronger one. And I will address this under the 3 points that we have presented earlier, under diplomacy, development, and defense. And firstly, on the issue of diplomacy, team proposition spoke to diplomacy forcing countries into further terror, and that going to Cuba, for example, in trying to form these ties with Cuba, we did not improve any situation within Cuba. And we see that as absolutely false. Absolutely false. Why? Because in forging these diplomatic ties with several countries, and when we look at Cuba, we see that there's a release of prisoners. We see that there's a decrease in embargoes. We see that there's a decrease in sanctions. And therefore, when we make moves towards improving relations, we make a more balanced area. We make a more balanced market. We make a balance and a framework where people have the ability to change. And that's what we're all about. We saw that the Obama's foreign policy, therefore, was catered at forming diplomatic ties and therefore decreasing the anti-US sentiment. And we proved to you this morning in showing those statistics that therefore the anti-US sentiment has decreased. And the reality is that Obama came in to a country which had a really bad reputation, and he was able to use his foreign policy, therefore, to turn this issue around. And therefore, they have not proven to you, ladies and gentlemen, how diplomacy has in fact been affected. On the second issue of defense, they focused a lot on the issue of drones, and we've presented this through our model. We've rebutted this through our model in saying that drones, in fact, were more accurate. So Obama saw the issue that there were a lot of civilian casualties and that there was a lot of war. But hey, he addressed the issue. And that's what Obama foreign policy did. He actually looked at the issue and nipped it in the bud. And that was that when we have men on the ground, one, we're seeing a lot of soldiers' lives lost. We're seeing a lot of civilian casualties. So he moved into a more effective and a more accurate approach, which was therefore to use drones, ladies and gentlemen. So therefore we see that in defense, he has in fact done more good than harm. And then we saw the issue of development, and we would put forward the argument about trade and economic benefits. We showed you therefore that trade agreements had an effect at home and it had an effect abroad. So therefore, if we have a president who is supposed to make change, and that's exactly what the Obama administration has done, we see that he's aided diplomacy, he's aided defense, he's aided development, and that his foreign policy was not only to benefit the US, the United States of America, but in fact helped the other countries. So ladies and gentlemen, you have a responsibility this morning, and your responsibility is to cast a vote. And I would propose that you cast that vote in favor of a team that aids diplomacy, that aids development, and aids defense. After all, foreign policy needs to address these issues, and therefore that's why I'm so glad to oppose this current vote. I thank you.
Speaking time was 3 minutes and 57. It's now my pleasure to ask Sean Lee to finish the debate and give the proposition's reply speech.
This debate fell into two areas of clash. Firstly is the area of Obama's inaction, and secondly is the area of Obama's action. So firstly, let's talk about his inaction. On a fundamental level, by virtue of Obama not intervening in Myanmar to liberate the Rohingyas, in Ukraine against annexation, in Damascus, Syria against chemical weapons, this means he has failed and therefore caused more harm than good. All of what I just told you was everything my first speaker told you. We had no response on that side of the house. We need to concede his inaction has caused more harm than good. With this nicely settled, let's move on to the second area of clash on his actions. And here we heard a lot more text, right? They began this debate saying that in the first speaker that the United States has the duty to be the world's police. So we then said, okay, if the United States uses, we say the United States has a duty to be the world's police, right? We told you, it used its status to intervene in the Srebrenica crisis in Bosnia during Bill Clinton. We then told you in my speech that the United States uses its world police status to invade Afghanistan under Bush. What do we hear? No response. So we can see ultimately that they can see that there's a duty on the United States to act as the world police. With this in mind, let's move on to the actual point. So we told you that they did not intervene in Afghanistan, they did not invade in a lot of areas within the Middle East. So evidently they weren't talking about the Middle East. So what were they talking about? They were talking about the sub-Saharan Africa, right? On how this has Millennium Development Goals. We told you that a lot of these development aid was siphoned off and used to enrich the local warlords. We heard no response, so evidently they were talking about these places. So the next one they brought to us was this whole notion of Iran and Cuba. So we said that, wait a minute, Obama could exchange for even more rights for political dissidents and even more respect for human rights within these societies in exchange for lifting the sanctions. So what do we hear? We get no response. Ultimately, this means that on this side of the house, the 200,000 political dissidents were to remain locked up in Cuba because they refused to do anything about it. So we then told you in the POI that Iran was actually the biggest sponsor of terrorism, right? So a lot of money from lifting the sanctions go to the government to fund even more terrorist attacks in groups like Hezbollah, for instance. We had no response once again. Finally, we told you that the Obama administration withdrew the troops from a lot of these regions and created a power vacuum that caused ISIS to take hold, and this has resulted in a lot of terrorist attacks all around the world. We told you this was a very important point. All we heard was, this is not a debate about Bush, let's not talk about Bush. This is a debate about Obama, we agree. But the thing is, Obama did this action, he removed the troops, and that's why there's a power vacuum that ISIS has occupied right now, and all of those harms is on their side of the house. They then mentioned the TPP, which came out in a POI from their third speaker to my third speaker, which is very interesting, because it came out really late in this debate, so evidently they do not really believe in this point. But secondly, we told you how the TPP only serves to alienate China and cause these countries like Philippines and Vietnam to even be more belligerent and aggressive in their territorial claims in waters. So we say this increased animosity in a global political scene as opposed to decreasing it, causing more harm than good. So at the end of the debate, we have proven to you that in sub-Saharan Africa, in South America like Cuba, in the Middle East like Syria and Iran, Obama's policy has done more harm than good. Ultimately, this is actually the entire world if you think about it. So at the end of the day, all their regions they want to talk about never really stood. The final point in this debate is on the point of drones, which I think I did a really good job in my substantive which I disprove to you. So let's repeat what I said. The first speaker said, I quote, drones help diplomacy. Really? Okay. How do you help diplomacy if you create more animosity between the Pakistani and Yemeni government and the United States? How do you create more diplomacy when you have drones actually killing innocent people for no other reason than they were there at the wrong place at the wrong time? We abhor this, we reject this. Ultimately, we think that you create even more animosity between the governments of the United States and Yemen and Pakistan, and therefore cause even more inability to counter and combat terrorism. For all these reasons, we think this one falls to outside the house. Panel, there are girls out there who are scared when the skies are blue. The sky being blue is a harmless indicator that the day is going to be a good one. Unfortunately for these people, it was a bad indicator because their life has been ruined by Barack Hussein Obama. And for all these reasons, we're very proud to propose.